right, welcome back. I'm Scott Casper in studio with one of the greats, Mike Chapman, the author of The Ages for the Sport of Wrestling. Nobody's told the story better. And he continues with his new book. It's called Pendleton, a very unlikely story about a young man who wrestled for Columbia, went on to the Olympics, and ended up in Hollywood as a major star. Mike, thanks for joining us, and tell us about the book. Tell us about the origins of the book.
Well, the idea for the book came at the inductions to the Glenn Brand Wrestling Hall of Fame at the Dan Gable Museum, which I was the creator of and the executive director of. And about 10 years ago, we inducted Nat Pendleton into the Iowa Glenn Brand Hall of Fame because he was born in Iowa, Davenport, Iowa. Not very many people know that. And he lived in Iowa only for about 6 months or so, Scott, so he didn't have the chance to pick up much wrestling expertise during those 6 months. And he moved back to his father's home in Cincinnati. His father was an attorney. And then they moved out to New York. And that's where he did most of his wrestling. He learned how to wrestle in the grass, he says, and in small YMCAs. Now remember, this was before the days of the NCAA tournament. So when he went to Columbia University, his first year was 1914. And there was no NCAA tournament. But he won the Eastern Intercollegiate Wrestling Association Conference title twice. He won the AAU Nationals twice. He was undefeated during his career at Columbia. He was also very popular on campus. I saw a newspaper from the era that said, Nat Pendleton, with his dark good looks and his rugged physique, has become the most popular man on campus. Then in 1920, he entered the Olympic trials and got first place at heavyweight and went overseas to Antwerp and won his first 3 matches, and in the final match for the gold medal, he lost a 1-1 tie referee's decision. But his coach later said it was the worst decision in the entire Olympic Games. Back then, each country could enter 2 people in an individual weight. And the second entry at heavyweight for the United States was Fred Meyer. Fred went on to a long, distinguished career as a professional wrestler. And he said many years later in an interview that Nat Pendleton was by far the best wrestler at the Olympics in 1920, and that he got cheated out of the gold medal. But Nat never made a big deal out of it. He came back to New York, and then he wrestled professionally for about 8 years. This was during the transition period, Scott, when professional wrestling was going from a true athletic contest to showmanship. And he was caught right in the middle of that incredible era. And of course, with his great amateur credentials, he was very popular in New York. He wrestled low on the card to start out with, but they called him an Olympic champion. He moved up the ladder very quickly, and pretty soon he was a star at Madison Square Garden. His match with John Pescic, known as the Nebraska Tiger Man, is one of the most talked about professional wrestling matches of all time.
Why?
To this day, people who are really into professional wrestling in the history will argue about the merits of the match, who actually won or who should have won, and what happened. Pescic was known as a policeman. You know this term because of your background in wrestling, but when they had the heavyweight champion of the world back then, the champions group of promoters and managers had what they called a policeman. So everybody wanted to challenge the heavyweight champion of the world for the prestige and the money and to climb up the ladder. But first you had to get by the policeman. The policeman was what was known as a hooker, a very deadly submission wrestler. He would have done very well in the MMA today. Well, the heavyweight champion of the world at that time, the championship was going back and forth between the great Joe Stecker of Nebraska and Ed Strangler Lewis. Very, very tough, rugged individual. Now, this was after the days of Frank Gotch, I might add. Frank Gotch was the heavyweight champion of the world, completely undisputed from 1908 to 1915. Frank retired undefeated in 1915. In fact, he won his last 88 matches in a row. Nobody could even come close to him. And Pendleton said, at the time he turned pro, that his hero was Frank Gotch. And he even looked like Gotch, about the same size, Scott, black hair, combed back the same way, about the same type of physique. So anyway, Nat had a lot going for him in terms of being promoted because he had the great amateur background and he was from the state of Frank Gotch. They called Iowa the wrestling state, even back then. So he is moving up the ladder. He's undefeated, something like 50-0. And he's challenging Ed Strangler Lewis. As a matter of fact, Scott, his manager laid out a challenge to Ed Strangler Lewis, the heavyweight wrestling champion of the world, and to Jack Dempsey, the heavyweight boxing champion of the world at that time, and said Nat would whip Jack in an all-out bout. So this is the first forerunner to mixed martial arts, way back in 1922, and there's Nat Pendleton right in the middle of all this. Well, what happened was Ed Strangler Lewis's management didn't hook him up with Ed Strangler Lewis. They wanted him to go through the policeman. The policeman was John Pesci of Ravenna, Nebraska. You can talk to anybody who studies the history of wrestling, and John Pesci is one of the top 5 hookers of all time. Deadly. What happened was in the middle of the hour-long match, 30 minutes into the match, they're on the ground, on the mat, sell-out crowd, and all of a sudden Pesci gets a knee lock on Pendleton. Pendleton knows he's in big trouble. He gets an ankle lock on Pesci. They're locked up, each trying to make the other submit, and Pendleton's ligaments snap. Mary Lee Pesci, John Pesci's daughter, who came to the International Wrestling Institute Museum when we inducted her father, told me that her father had told her many years later when Pendleton became a big Hollywood star, that's the guy whose leg I broke. Now, all through wrestling circles for many, many years, the pro people said that match is proof that an amateur wrestler has no business being in the ring with a hooker. Well, Pendleton, whose leg was severely damaged, later said it was give and take. It was just whoever pulled the hardest and the quickest. He said, John got the best of me, but I always wanted to wrestle him again. Pesci, many years later, and a lot of the pro people say, this shows how mean and vindictive Pesci was and why everybody was so frightened of him, because he delighted in breaking Pendleton's leg. I asked Mary Lee about that, and she said, that's not true at all. My father told me many times I really liked Nat Pendleton. I admired him. He was a great amateur wrestler. He just wasn't used to those kind of submission holds. I got him first. So Nat, he tired of all the theatrics that were moving into pro wrestling, so he moves out to Hollywood and gets really into theatrics. He ends up making almost 100 movies, Scott. He only starred in 3 or 4 of them, but he was in the top 3 or 4 of the casting all the way through his Hollywood career. Nat had a degree in economics at Columbia. He spoke 5 languages. He was extremely intelligent, but Hollywood typecast you immediately. And he played a couple roles as kind of a bumbling hoodlum type guy, and he never could break out of that mold. It really hurt his feelings. He wanted to be more because he was really good looking. But Nat Pendleton had a great career in Hollywood. He's the most successful wrestler ever to move into films. Like I said, made about 100 movies. Probably his 2 top movies were The Great Ziegfeld in 1936 when he played the legendary strongman Eugene Sandow, who also wrestled pro for a while. And he played that to perfection, and the movie was Best Movie of the Year in 1936, won an Academy Award. And he's the 4th billed actor in that. And Northwest Passage with Spencer Tracy in 1941. He has a great role in that too. He was with Bud Abbott, Lou Costello, maybe the best comedy team of all time. In Buck Privates, he has a great role in that. But after 100 movies and about 20 years in Hollywood, he retired. And he was married for the 2nd time. They never had any children, either marriage. And he was such a wrestling fan, Scott, that I talked to an AAU official many years ago. He's now deceased. And he says he can remember Nat Pendleton coming to a lot of big amateur wrestling tournaments on the West Coast. Very quiet, very dignified, and would sit in the stands, and people say, oh my gosh, that's Nat Pendleton sitting up there. He loved wrestling. He wrestled for the New York Athletic Club, and his picture today hangs on the wall in the Columbia University wrestling room. And you appreciate wrestling history as much as anybody I know. And Scott, these stories are so important. That people know that there was somebody like Nat Pendleton who, even though he had this great career in movies and could rub shoulders with the biggest stars in Hollywood, Clark Gable liked him personally, and he was friends with William Powell and some of the biggest names out there. that he was just a great person, lived his life, was walking down the street at the age of 72, suffered a heart attack, and died right on the spot.
Is that right?
No indication that he'd been ill or anything. So he's buried out there in San Diego. But because of this book, because of Andy Barth and Wayne Boyd, Nat Pendleton has sprung back to life, hasn't he?
He has, and Mike, you're one of the chosen few that not only can approach a job like this, but get it done. The foreword by Andy Barth. The foreword is by Andy Barth. The afterword, perhaps, is by you, because it gives you an opportunity to take a look at another life from the great sport of wrestling through Culture House Books. It's affordable. It's $14.95. We invite you to check it out. Get your copy. It's available. How many different places is it available? Online?
Yeah, Columbia University. Carl Fraunhofer, the coach, was very excited when the project first came out. They actually have got 500 copies of the book. I sent them 500 copies of the book so that Carl can use it in any way he wants to promote Columbia University wrestling. He is in the Columbia University Athletic Hall of Fame, Nat. He's also in the Glenn Brand Wrestling Hall of Fame in Waterloo, Iowa at the Dan Gable Museum. And I think he's going to go into the Quad Cities Hall of Fame. And Andy and I and Wayne are nominating him for the National Wrestling Hall of Fame in Stillwater, because with an undefeated college career and an Olympic silver medal and
Olympic status, film status, and he was an educated man, and that's what we're always talking about: student athlete first.
You're right, Scott.
Well, Nat Pendleton absolutely embraced it. Andy Barth has embraced your telling of it, and what a telling it was, Mike. Another great book. I'm looking forward to sitting down with you in coming weeks. I know there are other stories that will be coming out, and other projects that you're working on. Some that I know, and I'm excited, dude. Man, I tell you what, your career has been just absolutely tremendous. What you're writing, perhaps, is your greatest legacy. I appreciate it. I only encourage you to continue, because this is where wrestling's history lives, on the pages of the books you write. 28 of them to date. Mike Chapman has been our guest. Mike, thank you very, very much.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks for giving me the forum.